Welcome to a video tutorial on synthesis, which is combining your words and ideas smoothly with those of other writers. This is a skill that you'll need to use throughout any type of writing you do in college, especially writing that involves research. The basic idea behind it is that you read the text of someone else in our academic community, another scholar, other writers or experts, and you use their ideas as a basis for your own analysis. Don't make it any harder than that. There is a difficulty that comes from this, I find students often discover, in that the whole purpose of synthesizing something is that you come up with your own ideas. So it's not something that a professor can lecture to you on a certain subject and tell you the answers and then you spit them back out. That's contrary to the point of the whole process here. So you just need to take time and consider deeply what your objects of study are, and you will come up with answers. But it does take some time and energy. But I'm going to go through a process here, hopefully quickly, that will demonstrate to you a good method to use when synthesizing. You'll need to have read Robert Bly's essay, What the Image Can Do, and you'll need to have read the two poems, Maya Angelou's Phenomenal Woman and Charles Bukowski's Bluebird, to understand this lecture. In research, we often use the words and ideas of other writers as a lens for our own analysis of a subject. So what we're going to do today is look at the ideas of Robert Bly and his essay, What the Image Can Do, and we're kind of going to use those as a lens to analyze Phenomenal Woman and Bluebird, two poems. But this process is the same for any subject in any course in college. You're going to look at the ideas of another scholar, put those ideas on like glasses, or like you're borrowing the eyes of someone else, and then form your own ideas. That's the basic idea behind all of this, okay? I think that's a good way to visualize it. The first thing that you want to do when you begin the process of synthesis, of course, is to read, understand, and interpret the main ideas in whatever text it is you're looking at. And as I said, for this, excuse me while I move things around, in this instance, we're going to have read What the Image Can Do by Robert Bly, this document right here. Minimize some of these screens so we can see what we're talking about a little bit better. And we really want to look at the main ideas that our author has come up with. We have to do that first. We have to understand and interpret those main ideas before we can use them to form our own analysis, okay? So in his essay, Robert Bly it should be pretty easy for you to find his main ideas, because if you have this document, you'll notice that I have really underlined them all. The main purpose of Bly's essay is to put forth 6 powers that every good poem is made up of, and he says that those powers are the image, spoken language, psychic weight, sound, the drum beat, and the narrative story, okay? So we can look at those as the 6 main ideas of Bly's essay. And then the next thing, it's up to us to just understand and interpret those ideas. So hopefully if you've read this essay, you've started to develop some of your own ideas about what Bly has said here, these 6 powers that he says make up any poem. And your interpretation of them is where you're going to go toward in making your claims for analysis whenever you go to analyze the poem. So you're just basically going to take this idea of Bly, that there are 6 powers that make up a poem, those are his main ideas, and find a way to use those ideas to analyze poetry. That's what we're doing here. So I'm just going to walk through the process of what my interpretations are when I read this essay, and then whenever I read the 2 poems by Angelou and Bukowski. And I'm just going to look at 2 of his powers here. I'm going to look at the image, and then in a moment I'll look at psychic weight. When I look at what Bly says about an image, the quotation that stands out to me is that he says, an image always holds to one of the senses at least, to smell or touch or hearing, the seeing of color in motion. My interpretation of that is that Bly is saying that anything I can touch, taste, smell, physically feel, tactily, or see is what he's talking about when he talks about an image. So concrete things like bird or bee or smoke, things I can directly perceive with my senses, are what Bly would say are images. He doesn't say it directly, but I can assume and make my own interpretation that abstract concepts are not what Bly would call images. Things I can't perceive directly with my five senses. Abstract things like love, hate, fear, confusion, dejection, anger. Those types of words aren't things I can directly touch or taste or feel, and they're not what Bly would call images. So that's my interpretation. And as always with any interpretation, there's not a right or a wrong answer. There's just levels of how well you've thought it through, okay? To psychic weight, Bly says psychic weight is an adult grief in a poem. It comes from turning your face to your own life. That should be, oh, that is quoted, okay, sorry. It comes from turning your face to your own life, absorbing the failures your parents and your country have suffered, handling what alchemy calls lead. This is kind of a deep quotation here. But my interpretation of it, having thought it, reread it, and thought it through a bit, is that what Bly is talking about is that the psychic weight in a poem comes in places I can see maturity, reflection, or wisdom that only time can give. That's why he calls it an adult grief. So a poem like Mary Had a Little Lamb has less psychic weight because it deals with fewer feelings or thoughts that I would associate with age or wisdom than poems like Angelo's Phenomenal Woman or Bukowski's Bluebird. Those poems have a psychic weight that deals with a more complex adult issue, things like gender, beauty, isolation, self-destruction, things that I don't think I would have understood completely as a child. And that's my interpretation of what Bly talks about whenever he talks about psychic weight, okay? Your interpretations may be slightly different when you read Bly's essays and you look at his definitions of image and psychic weight, and that's fine. It just, again, matters how well you've thought them through and how much thought you've given it to them. Whenever you come up with your interpretation, whatever it is, you want to use that interpretation as a lens to analyze your objects of study. And here is the way to do it. Again, visualize yourself putting on the glasses of another writer or borrowing their eyes. But automatically, by using your interpretation of their ideas to come up with your own ideas, you'll be forced to make a claim in a way. And here's a real easy way to do it: is to turn their claim into a question that you can answer. You'll force yourself to make your own claim about the object. So I'll show you what I mean here. Let's start with the image. I've turned what I interpreted as Bly's claim into a question here, into a couple of different questions, actually. I said, what images, according to how I understand Bly's definition, things I can perceive with my five senses, do I find in Angelo's poem? What sense do I make of those images? Is there a pattern or a message there? So let me slip to Angelo's poem real quick. You can shuffle through these. And let's look. If you've read the poem, you know there are a lot of images in here. And again, these are things, and according to my interpretation, things that I can see or touch or taste or feel. Arms, hips, lips, knees, honeybees, eyes, teeth, waist, feet. What I begin to see, first of all, in this poem is that Maya Angelou uses a lot of images of the physical body, many images related to the physical body. That's a pattern of images, and I know that if I start to see patterns when I'm analyzing something, there's probably something intelligent I can say about it. What do the patterns of these images say to me? How do I interpret them? Well, to me, having read the poem several times, read it out loud to myself, and thought about it, I think that those patterns of images related to the body really deal with perception of beauty, both society's expectations and the speaker of the poem's expectations. Okay, this poem to me is very much about a woman struggling with the expectations of society that are on her and her own perceptions of herself. It's kind of an optimistic poem in that she's making some declarations about who she is and where her beauty really lies, and that it is phenomenal. So for me, if I were going to come up with a claim, I just now again all I did there was ask myself questions according to my interpretation of what Bly said are the powers in a poem. And by answering that question, I've already started to come up with a claim. And here's my claim. Maya Angelou's poem shows the reader a pattern of images that hold to our sense of sight. These visual images ask the reader to consider that beauty truly is in the eye of the beholder. Beauty changes if the beholder is society or ourselves. That's a fine claim to make in an essay. It's arguable. You can argue against it. And it is really reliant on me having synthesized my interpretations of Bly's ideas in my analysis of Angelou's poem. Okay? That's all it is. Don't make it any harder than that. You'll get stuck at some points in coming up with ideas, but take your time. Don't panic. Try to go through this process again and again and think about it. Don't save it till the last minute. And definitely don't give up if you don't get something at first and say, I'll never understand that poem or that author. Let's look at Bly's idea of psychic weight. Now, if you remember my interpretation of what he said about psychic weight is that it really comes down to this idea of adult concerns in a poem, things that a child wouldn't fully understand, things that take reflection and consideration and some wisdom maybe. So what adult concerns do I find in Bukowski's Bluebird? What grief is in the poem? What issues come from reflection or time, things that a child wouldn't yet understand? Of course, to me, the biggest image that comes out first is that image of the bluebird. It's the title of the poem. And the bluebird to me is fairly easy to, to me, my interpretation is pretty easy, that the bluebird represents a tenderness inside the speaker that he's afraid to show to the world. He hides this bluebird inside of him. He never lets it out. And a lot of the things that the speaker wrestles with are society's expectations of him as an adult man and his true self inside. You may not see that exactly in this poem. Your interpretation may be different, but I see that a lot. I see that the bluebird here represents a tenderness that as a man in our society, it's, frequently not allowed sometimes for men to show fragility or vulnerability or their deeper feelings. And that's what the speaker of this poem is wrestling with. That's what I see anyway. So my claim, based on Bly's ideas, might become something like this. The psychic weight in Charles Bukowski's poem comes from its attention to the adult grief, and then I have my in-text citation from Bly there, of being afraid to show one's vulnerability in a rough world. Now, if I wanted to compare that poem to Angelou's poem, I could do it too, because both of their subject matters now, I've decided, are pretty similar. Like Angelou's poem, it asks us to consider the difference between society's expectations of us and our perceptions of ourselves. So I've already, just from working through that short little process there, that took like 8 or 9 minutes, developed a couple of claims that could compare Charles Bukowski's poem to Angelou's poem. Remember that when it comes to this again, and it comes to your interpretation, there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. There are only better or worse answers. But you have to take your time. You have to think about what you've read. You have to reread it and consider your analysis deeply. Don't just wait till the last minute and go with your first thought and think that's good enough. And don't give up if you don't have a great, astounding thought right away. Take time, work on it, and you'll get there.